first discovered porn at about 9, 10 years old. I was over at my uncle's house and he had a chest full of pornography. This is the thing, it's funny because, people have said, well, there's nothing wrong with pornography, with adults and the whole thing. But the problem is that, you never find it as an adult. I don't know anybody who found pornography as an adult. You always find it as a child. It's everywhere. I didn't even know what sex was. But man, all I knew is when I opened that magazine and saw those ladies in that magazine and how beautiful they were, all my problems were gone. Like, it was numb. I had this addiction for the longest time.
How long?
Oh my God. All the way up until 2010. From the whole life, from the time I was about 10 to all the way up to about 12 years ago.
People addicted to pornography, they're not after the pornography. It's not about sex. It's about a temporary spike of dopamine in their brain. Dopamine being the brain chemical that makes us feel alive and vital and present and excited and curious. Addiction is a complex psychological, physiological process which manifests in any behavior that a person enjoys, finds relief in, and therefore craves in the short term, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up despite the negative consequences. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. Now notice I said nothing about substances. I said any behavior. Could also be sex, gambling, internet, relationships, shopping, eating, work, extreme sports, working out, pornography, any number of human activities.
You're craving connection, and that is something you can't buy. And the reason they're craving connection is because A, they don't know where to find it. We've almost shamed men for wanting and craving connection. And I can say in honesty, the men that cheat, the men that turn to pornography, the men that turn to escorts, I'm very non-judgmental because I understand behind every self-sabotaging behavior, there is a need that has not been met for a really long time. And for that need to be met, they turn to self-destructive behavior as a coping mechanism.
You mentioned porn and masturbation. This topic has come up a bunch of times on this podcast and on other podcasts I've gone on because of the relationship between dopamine, sexual motivation, and sexual behavior. And I've been of the pretty strong stance that while I'm not judging porn or masturbation, it can create a brain wiring situation. That's more about the brain wiring and neuroplasticity and dopamine. But what are your thoughts on porn and masturbation as they relate to hormones? I mean, this is a big debate on the internet. In fact, one of the most common debates is whether or not masturbation increases or decreases testosterone in males. Certainly, it will decrease motivation to go find sexual partners. We know this. Yes. And there are more and more data on this all the time. In terms of the effects of pornography and masturbation, and here I suppose we need to be somewhat specific and operationally define what we're talking about. We're talking about porn and masturbation to the point of ejaculation, right? Because my understanding is that the ejaculation and orgasm associated with it causes an increase in prolactin, which blunts libido for some period of time. The duration of that will vary from person to person and circumstance to circumstance. But basically all of this points to the fact that porn and masturbation can really limit libido in the real world.
That's an accurate statement. And prolactin does have a significant acute increase after ejaculation. It does to some degree after orgasm as well, but prolactin acts on the pituitary to inhibit the release of the hormones LH and FSH, of which LH can increase testosterone. So this may be one of the cases where the dose makes the poison. And if it is a very frequent habit, certainly daily or more than once a day, would be very detrimental from a hormonal component, not even taking into account the neural wiring.
Listen, I think it's terrific that you've actually defined frequency, because this is the problem. On the internet or even in the doctor's office, you'll see descriptions about pornography being dangerous for certain things or detrimental to hormones. People say frequent, but what's frequent? So you were saying daily or multiple times per day would be potentially detrimental to the hormone profile of a male of essentially any age.
And that's just for masturbation. With pornography, with porn use as well, it would likely be worse.
And why is that? Just the sort of dopaminergic drive of the stimulus, just a really intense visual stimulus?
Dopamine sensitivity. Using the analogy of a dopamine wave pool, it would deepen the pool, but not increase your supply of dopamine. The dopamine wave pool describes the natural variation of ups and downs in your dopamine or your motivation. And in the wave pool, depending on how high the peak is, you often have a deeper trough. So you do not want too high of a peak. In addition, if your peak is very, very high, for example, when you're using many substances like cocaine or like amphetamines, your dopamine can go so high, you lose almost all the water from the wave pool. And then when you crash from that, not only is the trough low, you have less dopamine in the pool to begin with. The dopamine receptor is extremely sensitive, as is the GABA receptor, which is an inhibitory receptor, whereas dopamine is technically a stimulant more related to adrenaline or noradrenaline. The depth of the pool can change very quick. So you want to have that happy medium where you're fairly near the top, but you're not so near the top that the depth of the pool is going to go down.
So if I interpret that in the context of this discussion about libido, sex, porn, and masturbation, if somebody has a very intense sexual experience, and not here, we're not necessarily talking about an intense orgasm. We're talking about just a lot of intense visual. So a lot of intense imagery or auditory input or both. That is going to lead to a situation where dopamine is going to be depleted afterwards.
Correct.
A guest on this podcast before, my colleague at Stanford, Dr. Anna Lemke, who's an expert in addiction, talked a bit about this, the sort of seesawing. Here we're talking about a wave and a crashing out of the water from the wave pool there. It was a seesawing from pleasure and pain. There's going to be a longer and deeper period of lack of pleasure following that. And I think a lot of people think, oh, well, that's great. They want the intense experience. But if that intense experience is coming from pornography and masturbation, or I suppose coming from high adrenaline activities like life risking parkour, hanging off the side of a building, it inevitably is going to lead to depressive episodes, low libido episodes that follow. Is that right?
Correct. In a similar physiologic way to withdrawal from stimulants like amphetamines.
Now, is sex with a partner different? Because there are many people who are chasing more and more intense experiences with a partner as opposed to through pornography and masturbation. Again, here we're talking about all ages. And I should always say, anytime we're talking about sex with a partner, we're talking, the 4 conditions that I always lay out on the Huberman Lab podcast are that we're talking about consensual, age appropriate, context appropriate, species appropriate interactions.
Yeah. And this is also a case where the dose makes the poison. So if there's, obviously meeting all those criteria, if they have one preference that for both of them is a positive experience, then that is likely okay. You're not going to be able to maintain dopamine over a certain threshold for a long period of time. So there very well may be a crash from that experience as well. And the crash may be different in one partner than the other.
Interesting. So I'll draw an analogy to food. It would be like, you don't have to serve the banquet meal seven nights of the week, maybe just 2. Is that right? And there are other delicious foods out there.
Yes.
Can we use that analogy?
That is very reasonable.
Okay. Not trying to be PG-13, just trying to parsimony, Occam's razor, the ability to describe a lot of things in a few words. I'd like to return to the key things that people should do, or I should say the key things that men should do to optimize their hormones. So we talked about getting some movement, getting some sunlight, getting quality social connection one way or the other, avoid excessively frequent masturbation and viewing pornography. And for some people, 0 might be the optimal number. And I keep coming back to this. For most people. Interesting. I hear so often from males of all ages about their addiction to it, their affliction by it. It's really a serious issue. And that's one of the reasons why I'm grateful that you're willing to talk about this and your clinical experience with these patients.
Please remember that Josh and Michael are not medical professionals. We strongly recommend consulting your doctor before attempting anything discussed in the class, particularly when it comes to matters of health.